if it's a small wobble, you just kind of work around it. And then at the end, what usually will happen if you're able to kind of work, keep your hands really steady, is that whatever wobble you have will sort of transfer itself to the lip of your piece. And at the end, you can choose whether to cut it off with a pin tool. So I just kind of keep going and see what happens. Okay, so I'm ready to start raising this. The way that I raise is holding a sponge in my right hand. My thumb is going to go on one side, and these 3 fingers are going to go on the other side, and I'm going to kind of hot dog my thumb into the sponge, right? And then I'm actually using my fingertips through the sponge to press into the outside of the clay. I know a lot of people are going to use this part of their first finger to press into the clay. So not their knuckle, but their first finger like this. And a lot of people feel a lot more control in that way. I have always just found it much easier to sort of work with my fingertips through the sponge. My left hand, this is always the thing that students ask about, is the position of the left hand, because it's actually the one that's, it's one you can't see when you're demoing, right? So it's a little bit more difficult to kind of get the hang of. So what I'm doing is I'm keeping all 4 of these fingers flat against the inside wall, right? The main pressure is going to come from my middle finger, actually from the pad and the tip of my middle finger, but it's always being supported by these 4 fingers. And these 4 fingers are always sort of face down, or it's palm down, and they're attached to the wall to keep it steady, right? And then my thumb, until the piece gets too high for me to do this, is always going to be kind of resting on the outside of my piece and in contact with my right hand. So usually my hands sort of look like this. So I'm resting my 2 thumbs together. The left thumb is resting on the exterior, and then my right thumb is resting on my left thumb, and these fingers through the sponge are kind of pressing into the outer wall. And the way that I raise, and I know a lot of people have different techniques for this, is to apply equal pressure on the inside and outside of the wall at the same spot. So I don't do that thing where one hand is above and one hand is below. I like my fingers to be at exactly the same spot. I feel that I have most control that way. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to find that spot at the bottom of the wall where my fingers kind of talk to each other across the wall. I'm going to commit to the pressure. Start applying pressure. I'm going to slow my wheel down just a little bit, and I'm going to start pulling up. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start pulling a cylinder shape, right? I'm not going to curve it yet. I'm not going to widen it yet. With bowls, or to create bowls that are really stable and sort of remain stable for the whole throwing process, you want to throw them with straight sides first. You want to throw them either as a cylinder or as a slight V shape, and you want to curve them at the very last minute. So the curve is the last thing that I'm going to do. Okay. I'm going to take another pull here. I'm spending a little bit of extra time. You'll notice down here, I hope you guys can see this, down here at the wheel head, and I'm sort of pushing in a little bit to just kind of get some of that excess clay that tends to spread out at the bottom of the wall to really move in and come up above the level of the interior floor. So I do that, right, and it creates this little, almost like a divot or a margin down here, and it raises a little bit of clay up higher than that, right? Just above the level of the interior floor. So once I've done that, I sort of take a minute and I smooth it out using my sponge before I start raising it up the wall. Because if I just kind of immediately started raising it, it might kind of bead off and come off the top rather than be incorporated into the wall of your piece. So I'm going to smooth it out, and then I'm going to start raising up the wall. Another raise. So a lot of the time with students, I notice that they're pulling over and over again, so many pulls, and the clay is not really moving very much. And that's a super common problem that happens to everybody, not just when they're starting out, but sometimes, you know, for a long time, because it's scary to pull up. Things tend to wobble and get out of control, and that can happen, you know, the faster you throw, the faster that can happen. But the problem is, if you're pulling and pulling and pulling and adding water, your clay is getting weaker and weaker. So if you're trying to make a form that's a little bit, you know, bigger or weirder, that has a lot of curves, that has angles, if you've been working the clay for a long time, it's probably going to get weak and it's probably going to collapse. So you really want to work on making your pulls effective. And for me, that means applying that pressure really equally from the inside and outside at the same time. So with my left hand, I'm not just pushing in with my outside hand, I'm really meeting that pressure with my inside hand. So all 4 of these fingers are attached to the inside wall, but this middle finger is kind of cupping in and it's really pressing against the same finger on the outside, right? So they're really kind of pinching across the wall. And that allows me to get quite a bit of height out of every pull that I do. And you'll notice too that once this gets tall, the way that I feel that I can control it is by getting really low in my body. So really kind of angling my elbow into my hip joint in order to sort of make a strong sort of unit of my body as I'm pulling the clay up. And that makes me feel like I can stay steady even though the height of the wall no longer allows me to kind of meet my hands. So instead of meeting my hands, what I'm doing is I'm meeting my elbow to my leg really strongly. Okay, so now I do what I call diagnosing the wall, which I do on pretty much every piece that I throw. I go in and I feel my wall out all the way from the bottom to the top, and I just kind of make sure that it feels even all the way up, and that there are no particular thin spots or thick spots. This feels okay. I still have that little wobble right there at the top. I'm not going to worry about that too much. I think I'm just going to kind of let it do its thing. Okay, so now I'm ready to shape this guy. So you'll notice that I'm starting with fairly straight walls. They're not exactly straight, but that's okay because we're going to be widening it out and curving it as well. I'm going to take one more pass that's kind of geared towards straightening it a little bit more and starting to V it out just a tiny bit. You'll notice that my rim is on the thicker side. It's not super thick, but it's thick enough so that when I, widen this out and it sort of stretches, it's not going to become paper thin. But I do like my bowls to feel fairly delicate. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to switch now to my rib tool. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to straighten out the wall, get a little bit of that excess clay off from the bottom. I'm going to start it all the way down at the wheel head and just kind of press it into the rib tool. Okay. And now I'm going to start widening it out. So the way that I make a bowl usually is to widen it in passes. So a couple different passes to get it to the width that I want while keeping the wall straight. So it's going to stay in this sort of V shape, but it's going to become a wider and wider V. And I'm going to do that using the rib tool on the outside. I don't have to use the rib tool. I can just go in and use my interior hand to kind of press into my exterior hand to support it. I always find though that the rib tool is quite useful for this. And I'm using this particular rib tool because it comes to a sharp point at the bottom, so I can really get it in there down at the base of the wall. So that looks like this. Get the interior nice and wet so that my interior hand kind of slides against it easily. The exterior you don't really have to add water to while you're doing this because the rib tool doesn't need as much lubrication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the rib tool perpendicular to the wall of my pot, and I'm just going to hold it a little ways out from where the wall currently is and press the wall into that line. So I'm just using the rib tool basically as a straight edge, and when I get to the top, I'm going to start moving the rib tool up to meet the rest of the bowl, the top of the bowl. I'm going to do that again. So with this technique, this is obviously not an ideal example because there's a wobble at the top. With this technique, what you're doing is you're establishing the circumference of the opening before you actually create the bowl shape or the curve. You can always, of course, leave it like this if you want, you know, a straight-sided kind of modern-looking bowl. I like to give it a little bit of a curve at the end. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do this one more time, establishing a little bit more width. Okay. And then I think it's time for me to curve this. So I'm happy with the opening, with the circumference of the lip. And now I'm just going to go in and I'm going to create a little bit of a curve right at the bottom. And I'm going to do that, I can do that a couple ways. I can do that by continuing to use the rib on the outside. And that just means that I would angle it a little bit away from myself and just push into it in smaller sections so that I can very gently curve it as I go. The other way I can do it is from the inside. So the ideal tool for that would be a kind of rounder rib tool, slightly larger than this, but I have a limited selection of rib tools at home. I was actually just very pleasantly surprised to find these guys in my drawer. I didn't think I had any. And what you can do is you can go down to the bottom of the interior wall and just very gently press out from there, just to give it a little bit more of a curve. Then I usually finish by going in and just kind of giving it one more ribbing on the outside to refine the curve. If you had a metal rib tool, which I don't right at the moment,